9-year-old Angie Housman lived in St. Anne, a quiet suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. On November 18, 1993, Angie was on her way home from school. She was last seen leaving the school bus at her normal bus stop, just 8 houses from her home. Angie never made it home. Her parents called the police to report her missing. 9 days later, Angie's body was found tied to a tree by a deer hunter in a bush wildlife conservation area in St. Charles, Missouri. Investigators concluded that she was alive when she was tied to the tree and passed away due to exposure. She had also been assaulted. Investigators were able to collect DNA from duct tape found at the crime scene and from Angie's body had belonged to an unknown man. Investigators believed that the crime could be linked to similar crimes that happened in the area, but were unable to prove it. Dozens of detectives were assigned to the case. A tip line dedicated to the investigation received more than 5,000 calls in just one day from people offering information. Unfortunately, the case would go cold for many years. That was until 2019. It was then that the case was reopened. In March of 2019, a crime lab created a DNA profile for the suspect. The DNA profile was placed into CODIS. It was matched to 61-year-old Earl Webster Cox. At the time of the crime, he had family and lived just a few blocks from Angie's school. Earl had joined the Air Force in 1975, but he was dishonorably discharged after it was discovered that he assaulted 4 children in Germany. He served 8 years in prison before being paroled for some stupid reason. In August of 2020, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Members of Angie's family appeared for the plea and sentencing. The sentencing came too late, however, for Angie's mom, who passed away in 2016 at the age of 52. Angie's brother Ron had this to say, "I was 2 when she was taken. She was a big part of my life, so to have her taken away like that was taking away my best friend." In March of 2021, Earl admitted to even more crimes, for which he was sentenced 10 years. He will serve this sentence simultaneously with the life sentence. 30-year-old Diane Lukosius lived in Camden County, Missouri in 1984. She worked as a dental assistant in the area. On December 15, 1984, Diane was driving home from a party when her vehicle was run off a dark lake road in Camelot Estates in Camdenton, Missouri. An unknown man then severely beat Diane. Diane was found next to her car. She was still alive. Sadly, she would pass away 2 days later because of her injuries. It would be difficult for investigators to find the person who committed the crime, as there were no witnesses, and DNA was not advanced enough to test the DNA left behind at the crime scene. It would only be in 1989, 5 years after the crime was committed, that investigators had a person of interest. They believed Larry Gene Hicks took Diane's life. He lived in Camelot Estates at the time of the crime, but relocated to Franklin, Louisiana. His family members said that Larry came home that night late, between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., which would have been right after the attack. He had a scratch on his cheek. He also had blood on his pants. When he entered the home, he went to wash his hands and his face, something he didn't do previous evenings. The next few days, Larry was drinking more and became more violent. Investigators interviewed him, but he denied any involvement. He said that a scratch happened during a car accident. Despite investigators believing he was very much involved, they did not have enough to arrest him. On May 12, 2021, Camden County detectives traveled to Larry's home in Franklin, Louisiana to question him. This time, he admitted that he saw Diane the day she passed away. He claims he was drinking for around 10 hours that day and was very intoxicated. He remembers seeing Diane at one of the bars he had been drinking in. Larry remembered very well what happened that evening, a little too well. When asked if he took the life of Diane, he said that he cannot remember, but he hopes that he did not. A DNA sample was then taken from him. 78-year-old Larry Gene Hicks was then arrested. If convicted, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. Camden County Sheriff Tony Helms said that he has been with the department since 1991, and he has seen how many thousands of hours that have gone into solving the case. He was also able to tell her family in person that an arrest has been made. Prosecutor J. Caleb Cunningham said, "This case has never left this community and has always been in the back of the minds of every person who has ever worked in justice enforcement, including me and my office. We were not going to rest because no matter what you do here, if you commit a crime, we will find you and we will charge you and spare no expense in doing that." In the middle of the night, on March 17, 1983, a Montgomery County Sheriff's Office deputy saw a fire burning in a wooded area of Interstate 45 in Conroe, Texas. When he investigated, he discovered the body of a woman that had been set on fire and was still burning. In the autopsy that was done, it was revealed the woman had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators were unable to identify the woman, but they were able to collect male DNA from her body. In 1986, a few years after the woman's body was found, the FBI ran her fingerprints and was able to positively identify her as Laura Marie Purchase. She was listed as a missing person from Houston, Texas. Henry Lee Lucas confessed to taking her life, and he was convicted for the crime. Case closed, right? Not yet. Henry Lee Lucas is notorious for confessing to crimes he did not commit. This was one of them. In 2007, investigators resubmitted the male DNA found on Laura's body for testing. It was discovered that the DNA did not belong to Henry Lee Lucas. It also did not match Otis Toole's DNA. Otis and Henry committed a lot of crimes together. The two of them enjoyed confessing to crimes so they would gain more notoriety. In October 2019, investigators submitted the DNA evidence for genealogy testing. This led investigators to Thomas Alvin Darnell. On March 17, 2021, Montgomery County cold case detectives traveled to Kansas City, Kansas to collect a DNA sample from Thomas. His DNA matched the DNA found on Laura's body. On May 11, 2021, he was arrested at his home and taken to Montgomery County. He is currently being held in the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office jail without bond. He has not yet entered a plea. It is unclear if he has an attorney who can speak on his behalf. 46-year-old Holly Simmons lived in Llano County, Texas in 2006 with her 17-year-old daughter. On November 27, Holly dropped off her daughter at a school bus stop. It would be the last time anyone saw or heard from her. The next day, her daughter reported her missing because Holly never made it home. Her house was examined for evidence, and neighbors, co-workers, and associates were interviewed by investigators. The Llano County Sheriff's Office and the Texas Rangers worked this case for years, but she was not found. Then in 2009, a recreational diver found a submerged aluminum boat at the bottom of a lake close to Holly's home. Her body was discovered at the bottom of the boat, with concrete bags placed over her. In 2016, the Texas Rangers Unsolved Crimes Investigation Program began to review the case. They named Jimmy Wolfenbarger as a suspect. He was Holly's landlord and lived nearby in an RV park. In May of 2021, 57-year-old Jimmy was arrested and sent to the Lubbock County Detention Center. Holly's brother, Paul Wishman, had this to say: "Hopefully he doesn't get away, and hopefully they've got a good case, and justice will be served for her kids, her grandkids, and the rest of the family." It is not yet known what led to the arrest or why he took her life. "91-year-old Leola Jordan lived in Picayune, Mississippi in 1998. She had raised 7 children and was well loved in the community. Neighbors said she would do anything for anybody. She would look out for kids when they got on and off the school bus. She was an all-around good lady. Sadly, her life would not come to a peaceful end. Leola's body was discovered in her home in late June 1998. She had been stabbed numerous times. It was baffling to investigators that someone would want to take her life. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing seemed to be stolen. For more than 2 decades, investigators have worked to solve the case. Finally, in May 2021, Sergio Williams was arrested in connection to the case. He is Leola's grandson. His DNA matched DNA found on items that the attacker had touched. He is currently being held in Pearl River County Jail. The DNA, along with witness statements, led to the arrest. It has not yet been revealed why Sergio did what he did. In January of 2021, 20-year-old Henry Williams was arrested in Jacksonville, Florida. In August 2015, when he was 14 years old, he assaulted an 8-year-old girl. The little girl was looking for a cat when she encountered this monster. She was not able to identify her attacker. She only said that he was a black male. In October 2020, Henry was imprisoned for a fatal 2017 carjacking. His DNA was taken, and it was realized in January 2021 that he was involved in the attack back in 2015. He is currently incarcerated at Lake City Correctional Facility. 19-year-old Barbara Mae Tucker lived in Gresham, Oregon in 1980. She was a sophomore studying business at Mount Hood Community College. Barbara was last seen on the evening of January 15, 1980. She was on her way to a night class at a community college. Multiple witnesses who drove by saw Barbara running onto Kane Drive from the wooded area on the west edge of the campus. It appeared to the witnesses that she was waving at someone or trying to get people's attention, but no one stopped to help her. The next morning, a fellow student found Barbara's body in a wooded area of the campus. She had been assaulted. Her belongings were also found nearby. Another witness came forward, telling investigators that he saw an unknown man that led Barbara back to the campus against her will. Her family believed that she may have accepted a ride from someone because she would not have walked to class that cold, rainy night. Investigators collected DNA from the crime scene that belonged to an unknown male and stored it so that it could be used later. Unfortunately, decades went by without identifying a suspect. Barbara's father, Albert Tucker, passed away in 1989, and her mother, Louise Tucker, passed away in 1995, without learning who took their daughter's life. Investigators from the Gresham Police Department recently contacted C.C. Moore from Rabon and Labs to solve the case. Rabon makes use of genetic genealogy. It is a process where an unknown suspect's DNA left at a crime scene can be identified by his or her family members who voluntarily submitted their DNA to a genealogy database. This allows investigators to create a much larger family tree than if they were limited to using law enforcement databases such as CODIS. Using this process, investigators discovered that the unknown male DNA found at a crime scene back in 1980 belonged to 59-year-old Robert Plimpton. On June 8, 2021, He was arrested from his home in Troutdale, Oregon. He is married and has a son. He is currently in custody at the Multnomah County Detention Center. At the time of the crime, Robert was 16 years old and in high school. Investigators found that he had quite a long criminal history. He was convicted of kidnapping in 1985 and served a 2.5-year sentence until 1987. He also served sentences for driving under the influence and parole violations. In 1997, he was also accused of assaulting a woman, but the case was dismissed. Investigators are also looking into the possibility that he could very well be responsible for more crimes. C.C. Moore from Rabon had this to say, "I have worked on hundreds of cases, but this case stuck with me unlike any others. I would wake up thinking about it and go to sleep still thinking about it. I'm so happy the family will get some answers, though I don't believe there's ever closure. But if he is convicted, there may be some justice." Barbara's siblings lost hope that the case would ever be solved. They were convinced that the person who took Barbara's life was deceased. They said that she will sadly never age past 19. She was almost 6 feet tall, strong and athletic. Her hair was light brown, her eyes a warm chocolate brown. She was outgoing, smart and determined. Barbara was the first one of her family to attend college, but sadly she would never get to graduate. News of the arrest brought overwhelming emotions from her siblings. The extraordinary break in the case provides some comfort, but it has also reignited their grief. Someone brutally took her away from us when she was so young and went on living their life after. We want to see some justice, and we hope this is the right person. Norm Frink is now a retired chief for the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. He recalls all the work that was put in to help solve the case. He also remembers how absolutely devastated Barbara's parents were and that they blamed themselves. "I only wish this had happened sooner, but the technology has evolved and fortunately there's finally been an arrest. It is a positive development and I'm just sorry that Barbara's parents did not live to see it." 15-year-old Julie Ann Hanson lived in Naperville, Illinois in 1972. She was described as a very personable and sweet girl. On July 7, 1972, Julie was last seen leaving home on her bicycle, heading to a baseball game. When she did not make it back home, her family got worried and called the police, informing them that Julie is missing. The next day, on July 8, Julie's body was found in a cornfield in Naperville. She had been assaulted and also stabbed close to 40 times. Investigators followed leads and questioned potential suspects, but they were not able to identify the man who committed the heinous crime. In 2020, investigators believed that Bruce Lindahl could be the man they are looking for. He was involved in a similar crime that I've covered on my channel before. Investigators tested his DNA, but it was not a match to the DNA of an unknown male that they collected from the crime scene in Julie's case. Finally, on June 9, 2021, investigators announced that they arrested 76-year-old Barry Lee Welpley in connection to the case. They said that his DNA matched the DNA found at the crime scene, but did not want to give any more information, as it could compromise their case against him. We do know that he was arrested at his home in Mounds View, Minnesota. At the time of the crime, he was 27 years old, worked as a welder, and lived less than a mile from where Julie lived. He is currently being held at a Will County jail. His bond was set at $10 million. One of Barry's family members used a commercial DNA service to explore family history, and it led investigators to Barry after all of his years. Anyone with additional information regarding the investigation is encouraged to contact the Naperville Police Department at this number and ask for the Investigations Division. Naperville Police Chief Bob Marshall had this to say: "This horrific crime has haunted this family, this community, and this department for 49 years. The investigation and resulting charges were truly a team effort that spanned decades, and I could not be more proud of the determination and resourcefulness of our investigators, both past and present, who never gave up on Julie. Julie's parents had passed away, but other family members were grateful for the news. 19-year-old Janet Stallcup lived in Garden Grove, California in 1976. She was a nursing student and a part-time employee for the UCI Medical Center. On December 19, Janet was heading in her car to a party. She never arrived at her destination. Janet's family and friends got worried and the police were called. 8 days later, her body was found inside her car, about 2.5 miles from her apartment. Janet had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators were able to obtain DNA from an unknown man at a crime scene. DNA technology was not advanced enough to identify the man. Janet was laid to rest at the Forest Lawn Memorial Cemetery. In 2002, investigators were able to create a DNA profile of the attacker. It was submitted in a combined DNA index system, but no matches could be made. In 2020, investigators from the Garden Grove Police Department decided to make use of genetic genealogy to help solve the case. The DNA that was collected from the crime scene was then entered into public DNA databases. It led investigators to Terry Dean Hawkins. He also lived in Garden Grove and worked as a mechanic. He had a criminal history that included drugs, weapons, DUI, and indecent exposure. On July 4, 1977, he was arrested for disorderly conduct and taken into custody. The next day, he passed away due to an overdose. This meant at less than a year after he took Janet's life, he was also buried at a Forest Lawn Memorial Cemetery. Investigators were able to find his DNA sample that was taken at his autopsy, and it confirmed that he indeed ended Janet's life. It was announced to the public on July 14, 2021. For Janet's sister, Lee, who was 15 years old when Janet was taken, it is a bittersweet moment as their mom passed away and never learned who took her daughter's life. Lee said that no one in the family had ever met Hawkins. Investigators believe it was a random act of violence. 32-year-old Diane Vegas lived in Golden Meadow, Louisiana in 1977. She was married to Chester Vegas Sr. The two of them owned a restaurant called the Chicken House, located less than a mile from their house. Just before 11 p.m. on October 10, 1977, Chester called 911. He told them that he found Diane's body in the restaurant's kitchen. Diane had been fatally shot in the back. Investigators also found that a cash register had been tampered with, giving the crime the appearance of a robbery gone wrong. Chester was taken into custody and questioned, but he was let go again. Investigators had no evidence that he was involved, and there was also no evidence pointing to anyone else, so the case went cold for many years. In October 2020, investigators received new information that led to the case being reopened. Investigators painstakingly reviewed the 44-year-old case file and went back over evidence, details of witness interviews, and alibis for those witnesses. A witness who initially provided an alibi for Chester recanted his statement. A second person told detectives that Chester privately admitted that he took Diane's life. In June of 2021, 78-year-old Chester Vegas was arrested in connection to the case. Sheriff Greg Weber said that new information, in combination with evidence established during the initial investigation, gave detectives the probable cause they needed to make an arrest. He said in a statement, "We hope this arrest can begin to bring some closure to the Vegas family, who have been living with questions about what happened for nearly 44 years. Essentially, there are relatives of the victim who remained vigilant in keeping up with the case over the years, and they led detectives to go back and look at it and reanalyze the evidence. They then realized the case strongly pointed in one direction, and that direction was the husband. Chester Vegas was released on the same night he was arrested after posting the $50,000 bail. Two of Diane's grandchildren spoke out with the one expressed anger at her grandfather had been released on bond. My sister and I were robbed of ever meeting our grandmother and my sister's namesake because of this man, and they let him walk. We always knew he was guilty, and when we finally get a chance for justice, they give him a bond. It is insulting and disgusting. It was also then revealed that Chester Vegas Jr. had provided his father's alibi. He lied to investigators because he did not want to lose both parents. If convicted, Chester Vegas Sr. faces a sentence of life in prison without parole. 14-year-old Stephanie Ann Isaacson lived in Las Vegas, Nevada in 1989. She attended El Dorado High School. On June 1st, Stephanie left her home just after 6 in the morning and walked to school. Later in the day, her dad became concerned when she did not come back home. He then learned from her friends that she never made it to school, so he called the police. Stephanie's body was soon found in an abandoned lot near Stewart Avenue and Lynn Lane, less than a mile from her high school. The autopsy revealed that she had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators collected DNA from the crime scene that belonged to the man who ended her life. In 1998 and again in 2007, the DNA was tested and submitted to CODIS, but no matches were made. It would only be recently, with the help of genetic genealogy, that progress in the case could be made. In November 2020, a DNA lab offered to use their new technology to help solve the cold case for investigators. The funding to pay for the DNA testing came from an anonymous donor. It would not be easy, as there was very little DNA left, the equivalent of 15 cells. Finally, on July 21, 2021, investigators announced that they got a DNA match and identified a man as Darren Marchant. He had been arrested in 1986 for taking the life of a woman, but the case lacked evidence and was dismissed. Darren took his own life in 1995. Investigators believe it was a random attack and he did not know Stephanie. If she was still alive today, she would be turning 47 on August 12. Stephanie's mom had this to say in a statement: "I never believed the case would be solved. It is good to have some closure, but there's no justice for Stephanie at all. We will never have complete closure because nothing will ever bring my daughter back to us." 8-year-old Joshua Randall Harmon and his family lived in Roswell, Georgia in 1988. He was described as an amazing young boy who had an uncanny relationship with nature and with God. Joshua was a student at Kimball Bridge Elementary School in Alpharetta, Georgia, and loved ice cream and playing outside with his friends. On May 15, Joshua was reported missing by his parents when he did not make it home for dinner. One article said that he ran outside as there was an ice cream vendor outside the apartment complex, and another article said that he had been playing outside with his friends and never made it back home for dinner. A neighbor came forward and said that Joshua stopped by their home around 7 p.m. that night to see if his son wanted to come outside and play. The neighbor said no, as they were about to eat dinner. Joshua then told the neighbor that he will wait in the woods behind the apartment complex for his friend to come play with him. This was the last sighting of Joshua alive. For the next 48 hours, extensive searches were done for Joshua. Sadly, his body was discovered in the woods nearby. Investigators determined that he had been strangled. It appeared as if he had also been assaulted. The crime was one that really shocked the community. Over 250 people attended the funeral. Roswell investigators, alongside the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, investigated the case extensively and collected evidence, but the case went cold. At the start of 2021, Joshua's body was exhumed in hopes of identifying more evidence. Investigators worked with an independent lab called Cybergenetics Incorporated. they were able to collect DNA belonging to an unknown man from Joshua's body. In July of 2021, they identified 56-year-old James Michael Coates as the person who took Joshua's life. He lived in Woodstock, Georgia, but back in 1988, he lived in the same apartment complex as Joshua. On July 21, 2021, James was arrested during a traffic stop while in the back of an Uber. He is currently in a Fulton County jail. On July 22nd, investigators had a press conference to announce that an arrest had been made. Joshua's aunt, Marlene Carlisle, said that Joshua's mom, Sherry, passed away in October 2020. Sherry never gave up while she was still alive and made sure that investigators kept working the case. Investigators said that James had spent about 20 years in prison for an unrelated crime, but did not specify what he did. William and Ina Campbell lived in a house on Jackson Road in Clarksville, Tennessee in 2010. They were both in their 80s and enjoying a peaceful life. On January 29, the Campbell's neighbor, Daniel Champagne, tried calling them a few times. Daniel was like a son to them and said that they were his second mom and dad. He also had a key to their house, so when they did not answer any of his calls, he went inside. He found that the house had been ransacked. The kitchen cabinets were all open. Daniel also made a gruesome discovery. He found William and Ina in their bedrooms, each with a gunshot wound to the head. They had medical issues and slept in separate bedrooms. Ina still had her oxygen tube inside her nose when he found her. It was determined that her lives were taken while they were sleeping. Neighbors told investigators that this is strange, as their dogs would have barked if a stranger came in and woke the Campbells up. It led investigators to believe that the person responsible knew the dogs and the couple. Their adopted son, William Roger Campbell, then became a person of interest. It was speculated that he would gain financially from the crime. No evidence that he took his parents' lives could be found however, and the case went cold. Then on June 21, 2021, William Roger Campbell was arrested at his home in connection with the case and taken to Clarksville. He is now in a Montgomery County jail. Investigators have not given a reason of why he was arrested, but you have to believe that his appearance does not help his case. Detective Keenan Carlton had this to say: "These were innocent victims. These were people who were beloved by their community. They lived in their neighborhood for a number of years. Their neighbors loved them and were all happy to see some resolution." Keenan gave credit to detectives who worked the case a decade ago for laying the groundwork in the investigation, and said that a recent review of the case allowed detectives to put a final piece of the puzzle together and arrest Campbell. 20-year-old Darlene Krashoc was an active duty soldier stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1987. On March 16, she went out with members of her unit at a local club named Shuffles. She was last seen leaving the club between midnight and 1 in the morning. On March 17, her body was found behind a Korean club restaurant. She had been strangled. Investigators were able to collect DNA from the crime scene that belonged to an unknown man. The DNA was found on a wire hanger that was used to strangle Darlene. In 2016, investigators submitted the evidence they had to the United States Army Criminal Investigation Lab for additional DNA testing. They were able to narrow down predictive traits for the suspect, including eye color, hair color, skin color, and face shape. 2 composite sketches were made showing what a suspect may have looked like at 25 years old and at 55 years old. In 2019, investigators made use of genetic genealogy. They submitted the DNA they had to ancestry sites such as 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Forensic scientists found people in Wisconsin and Texas who had similar DNA to the samples found at a crime scene. Eventually, they believed that 58-year-old Michael Wyatt took Darlene's life. They found that back in 1987, he lived just a few miles from the crime scene and was also a soldier at Fort Carson. Photos of Michael also matched the composite sketch. Investigators had to make sure that he's indeed a man they are looking for before they arrest him. They followed him from his house to his work. They then watched him drink from a fast food cup. Investigators obtained the cup, and after some more DNA testing, it was confirmed that his DNA matched the DNA found at a crime scene. It was announced in June of 2019 by investigators that he had been arrested. In 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison without a chance of parole. 42-year-old Judith Nesbitt lived in Irvine, California in 1980 with her husband and 4 children. On November 26, she left her house to go to Newport Beach. She was going to show her family's boat named Felicidad 4 to a man who she believed to be a potential buyer. When Judy did not make it back home, her husband got worried, so he went to the boat to see what was going on. He found her body in the bedroom of the boat. She had been shot. Her credit cards, checkbook and money she had on her was stolen. Investigators found strands of hair on the boat that had not belonged to any of the family members. It was believed that a Night Stalker could be responsible for taking Judy's life. Witnesses soon came forward and said that they saw Judy with a Caucasian man. This made it less likely to be the Night Stalker, as he was believed to be Hispanic. Eventually, the Night Stalker was discovered to be Richard Ramirez and was confirmed that he had no involvement in what happened with Judy. Investigators released sketches of the man that was seen with Judy just before she passed away. In 2002, investigators were able to create a DNA profile of the suspect from the forensic evidence they collected from the crime scene back in 1980. It was submitted to the combined DNA index system, but no matches could be made, unfortunately. In 2018, Green Lab, an independent company, was able to create a more detailed DNA profile. They were then able to make use of genetic genealogy to identify the suspect. On August 9, 2021, it was announced by the Newport Beach Police Department that Kenneth Alwyn Marks is the person who ended Judy's life. Frustratingly, he passed away in 1999. Not much is known about him, just that he was 44 years old when he passed and he was described as a loner. Judy's eldest son, Steve Nesbitt, had this to say, "Personally, I wish he was still alive. I would have loved to have had a knock on his door and have handcuffs on him." Judy's husband, Fred, passed away earlier this year, but he was told about the case being close to solved before passing at the age of 85. "20-year-old Michelle Louise Wyatt lived in San Diego, California in 1980. She was attending Grossmont Community College and was a cashier at Safeway in Mission Hills. Michelle lived in a condo complex at Kerrigan Court in Santee, San Diego with a roommate. On October 9, 1980, her roommate made a startling discovery. Michelle's body was found on a living room floor. She had been assaulted and strangled using a telephone cord. Investigators made a timeline of events. Michelle's boyfriend left her condominium and locked the front door in the early morning on October 9. Soon after he left, witnesses heard screaming coming from where Michelle lived, but nobody called 911. 2 separate DNA profiles were taken from Michelle's body. One belonged to her boyfriend and the other from an unknown man. Michelle's boyfriend was soon eliminated as a suspect. Detectives interviewed numerous people but were unable to identify the unknown man, and the case went cold. In 2001, the unknown suspect's DNA profile was entered in the combined DNA index system. No matches could be made, however. In September 2020, investigators made use of genetic genealogy to help identify the suspect. Finally, in August of 2021, it was announced that John Patrick Hogan is the man that took Michelle's life. He was 18 years old at the time of the crime. He was born in Arizona in 1961. In his 70s, he moved to San Diego and attended Santana High School. He lived less than a mile away from Michelle. John also had friends who lived in Michelle's complex. In 1979, he joined the Air Force. He was stationed in New Mexico and moved around between California, Idaho, and Arizona. He passed away from a heart attack on October 9, 2004 in Phoenix, Arizona. He was 42 years old. He took Michelle's life on October 9, 1980, so this meant that he passed away 24 years after Michelle to the day. Detectives do not believe that he is connected to other unsolved crimes in San Diego, but have shared a case with agencies where he lived, specifically in his 70s and 80s. Michelle's parents are now in their 80s and were relieved when a detective came to tell them the news. Michelle's boyfriend was also present. He still often visits her parents. Michelle's mom, Louise Wyatt, had this to say, "I'm glad to find out that he is gone. But I'm missing something. What is the word I'm looking for? Closure. I don't have closure, and that is what I need. At least now I know this guy isn't out there anymore, but I would still like to get him," she said. 52-year-old Daniel Mason Woolley lived in Clayton, Idaho in 1980. It is an extremely small town with a population of just 7 people. At 10 p.m. on September 22, 1980, Daniel was drinking at a sports club bar. A fight broke out between Daniel and a man named Walter James Mason. Daniel saw that Walter was hitting his wife, so Daniel and 2 other men escorted Walter out of the bar, and a fight took place. Walter made it to his pickup truck and took out 2 pistols. He then shot Daniel once on the right side of his head, just above the ear. Walter then managed to flee. Investigators were not able to find him. A wanted poster was put up, but did not lead anywhere. It would take an unbelievably long time for investigators to find Walter. In October 2019, they finally found him. He had been living under the alias Walter James Allison. He was arrested and taken back to Idaho to face trial. In June of 2021, Walter passed away while in custody at the age of 85. It was revealed that Walter had lived the last 25 years in Rising Star, Texas. He lived with a woman named Beverly Meacham, who passed away a few months before he was arrested. Beverly's daughter did some research on Walter and found that he was wanted in Idaho. She told investigators, and it led to the arrest. Daniel's son, Brett, had this to say, "After nearly 40 years of running free, the man who took my father's life passed away last night. I hope the devil has time for him. This has been a long chapter." 17-year-old Leslie McCray lived in Jacksonville, Florida in 1985. She was a student at the University of North Florida and aspired to be a model. At 2 in the morning on Christmas Eve, Leslie and her boyfriend was in her apartment sleeping. Her boyfriend woke up to a man standing next to the bed. He had a knife. The man then tied Leslie and her boyfriend up. The boyfriend watched in panic as Leslie was then dragged away by the unknown man. He managed to free himself and called the police. They immediately started searching the area. Sadly, her body was found a few hours later along the side of a road. She had severe injuries to her head and chest. Investigators from a Jacksonville Sheriff's Office then collected evidence from the crime scene. This included DNA evidence that could be used later to help identify the unknown man. Investigators asked the public for anyone to come forward with useful information. They also had interviews with criminals in the area who have committed similar crimes. It led nowhere and the case went cold. A DNA profile for the suspect was created and submitted to CODIS, but no matches could be made. In 2019, Leslie's family reached out to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to look into the case again, so they did. Recently, in April of 2020, investigators again submitted the DNA profile and found that it matched a prisoner in the Michigan Corrections database. The prisoner is 59-year-old David Nelson Austin. He is serving a life sentence for unrelated crimes. Investigators found that he did live in Jacksonville at the time of the crime. After some more DNA testing, it was confirmed that he is responsible. A press conference was held on August 20, 2021, where it was announced that David has been indicted. Investigators are now working on getting David extradited from Michigan to Florida to face the charges against him. In August of 1992, a swimmer found a body of a baby in a Catawba River in York County, South Carolina. The baby was female and found wrapped in a bedsheet inside a plastic grocery bag. The child had been stabbed numerous times. An autopsy revealed that the baby passed away due to suffocation, not drowning or the stabbings. Investigators were unable to identify the baby, so she was named Baby Angel. It was determined that she was only a few hours old when her life was taken. Investigators found DNA on the bedsheet and collected it so it could be used later. They did not get any leads, so the case went cold. In October 2020, detectives re-examined the case and submitted the DNA from the bedsheet to the York County Forensic Lab for testing. The results came back and showed that the DNA belonged to 48-year-old Stacy Michelle Costner-Rabon. She is the mom of Baby Angel. In August of 2021, Stacy was arrested at her home in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and she was not very happy, as you can see. She did not deny that the baby was hers. Investigators have not been able to find the child's father and are uncertain that he is still alive. York County Sheriff Kevin Tolson had this to say, "I am very thankful for the hard work of our detectives and DNA analysts. Their dedication has led to the closure of a case that has haunted our community for years." 18-year-old Kaitlyn Arquette lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1989. She graduated from high school on June 14. Kaitlyn had been accepted to the University of New Mexico. Her aspirations were to attend medical school one day. Directly after graduation, she moved into an apartment with her boyfriend, Zhang Niop Wen. He was 8 years older than her, but she told her parents that he was only 4 years older, so they would not worry. Zhang took part in a lot of criminal activities and belonged to a Vietnamese gang. 6 weeks after moving in together, Kaitlyn told her mom, Lois Duncan, that she and Zhang had been having problems and they were constantly arguing. Kaitlyn planned to break up with him. On July 16, she was heading to her mom's house at 11 p.m. in her car. She reached an intersection. Another car then pulled up next to her, and one of the passengers shot her twice in the head. It was just before midnight that Kaitlyn's family learned that she was in the emergency room. They rightfully believed that she had been in a car accident. It was only when they arrived at the hospital that they were told that she had been shot. Investigators went to her apartment to see what they could find. They found Zhang. He claimed to be unaware of the shooting and said he was out with friends all night. Sadly, Kaitlyn passed away from injuries 24 hours later. In 1990, investigators announced that Kaitlyn had been a victim of a random act of violence. Her family did not believe this was the case. Her family believed that Kaitlyn knew too much about Zhang's criminal activities and the gang members were scared that she would go to the police. Her family also discovered that phone calls were made from Kaitlyn's apartment at virtually the same time her life was taken. This made it seem that Zhang was lying when he said he was out with friends that evening. Investigators refused to believe that Zhang or his gang was involved and are not investigated. Also in 1990, an informant led investigators to Robert Garcia. He was interrogated for 2 hours. Robert said that evening he was in a car with Dennis Martinez, Juvenal Escobedo, and Miguel Garcia. He also said that Miguel Garcia was the one that shot Kaitlyn. All of the men were arrested, but the case soon fell apart when it was discovered that Robert Garcia was in prison that night. Kaitlyn's family then decided to hire a private investigator. He found that a man named Paul Apodaca was found standing next to Kaitlyn's car when police arrived on the scene. He had an extensive criminal history, but was somehow never questioned during the initial investigation. In July of 2021, when he was questioned, he confessed. He also confessed to taking the lives of 2 other women. I will make a separate video on other women. Kaitlyn's family is relieved, but critical of the Albuquerque police for never questioning Apodaca and letting him walk away from the crime scene.